Good evening. Thank you. Good evening. Well, I'll start with a couple of announcements. We want to remember the funeral for K.O. Fuller Friday here at the building at 1:30. There will be a visitation at Stockham Funeral Home tomorrow from 5 to 7, I believe, 5:30 to 7:30. Does anybody remember? I should know that information. 5 to 7? Okay. With the family present there from 5 to 7. So, there is a family luncheon before the funeral, but just a kind of a private family luncheon, yeah. So is that all taken care of? Okay, there you go. Okay. We'll have second Sunday servants this Sunday night. Ladies Eat Out is next Tuesday, June 13th. See Tracy for questions about that. And then dates for several other things coming up. The date for Vacation Bible School has been set for July 17th through the 19th. And Michael has ordered the material for that. It should be in the next day or two. And then those that want specific jobs can get started getting ready for Vacation Bible School. That'll be exciting. Any other announcements at this time? Okay. Song.
I just looked at the list and our song leader isn't here, so. Okay, how about 383? 383, Jesus, keep me near the cross. 383.
Jesus, keep me near the cross, there a precious fountain, free to all a healing stream, flows from Calvary's mountain. In the cross, be my glory.
us pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, we are so grateful for this opportunity to be here and study your word. We're just thankful for the rain you've given us, and we just appreciate all the blessings. Ask that you be with the Fuller family at this time after their loss of Ko. We just thank you for his life and the example he's been. Be with Jason now as he presents his lesson to us and help him recollect his thoughts. And we just thank you again for this time, and be with us the rest of this evening in your Son's holy name. Amen.
Well, good evening. I'm going to be gone the next 2 Wednesday nights. And so Johnny is filling in, taking over. And I'm going to try really hard to get through this lesson, Johnny, so that you can start fresh with a new one and not have to try to wrap up something I started. So, with that being said, we're going to jump right in to where we're at. So, I just always stick the map at the front in case there's something in the lesson that I need to refer back to a map on, and there's not really anything on this one. So, we are in Isaiah 41 and 42, and last week at the conclusion of, we finished Isaiah 40, and really did most of the introductory material for 41 and 42. So I'm just going to kind of go through that real quick, just to kind of get us reoriented into where we're at. The objectives for this, for these chapters, the student can share how Isaiah uses history to establish the existence and power of God. You'll see that through the lesson tonight, through some of the things we talked about. The student can explain the sections of hope and reassurance and understand how they function in this section of Isaiah. And then the student can share that many exiles did not respond to God, which is hard to understand given the perspective that we have, and yet sometimes I think that people might look at the way we respond to God and think, y'all are doing the same thing they did. That we don't respond to God the way that we should at times as well. And so we look at what they do and try not to be too hard on them, because we understand that we find ourselves in the same boat very often. People in Babylonian captivity fall into three categories: those who were assimilated and took that too far and actually worshiped the Babylonian gods, and those who were in despair, and then those who were hopeful, those who clung to the promise that God was going to act. And we've talked about the historical background. That really was the introduction stuff to chapter 40 as well. We're clearly, I think, talking about people who were in Babylonian captivity through this whole section, chapters 40 through 55. And this is squarely in what we're going to get into tonight. Kind of serves as a theme for the whole section, but really, the God of hope and history sends a servant. I mean, that could just be the theme of chapters 41 and 42, because it hits all of those things in the chapters that we'll look at tonight. And this was an interesting thing to put things in perspective for us. The three periods of Israelite history that are being addressed in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah lived during that first period, 750 to 605, which was Assyrian domination. But then he also wrote to later generations that were going to be under Babylonian control or under Persian control. And he wrote very specifically about some of the things that they would encounter, even though he wrote 150 years before they ever saw those things. So that is an important piece for us to keep perspective on the entire book. And the kind of the two central questions that Isaiah deals with: does God care, and can God act? And we kind of see that theme recurring over and over again. and Isaiah is doing all that he can to provide a yes answer to both of those questions. God does care, and he can and will act on behalf of the Israelite people. And so we'll see a little bit of some of this stuff tonight. The poetry of Isaiah, we'll see some of that vivid imagery tonight. We'll see an example or two of some pronoun type things that are interesting in Isaiah. We talked about that last week, that sometimes it's often hard to really understand what pronoun Isaiah is referring back to. And so that affects the interpretation. If Isaiah is talking about King Cyrus versus God, and you're not sure which he, Isaiah, means, well, that's two big differences. You know, if he's talking about a king, that's one thing. If he's talking about God, that's something altogether different. So we've got to get those pronouns figured out sometimes to make sure that we understand what Isaiah is saying. We reviewed a little bit Isaiah chapter 40 last week. I'm going to skip that part to get ahead to where we're at. Okay, so this is where we're going to be tonight. So preview of 41 and 42. There are two courtroom scenes, both in chapter 41, that show God's superiority. There are words of hope to show that God cares. There's a promise of a coming servant to set things right, and we'll get into identifying who that servant is. And in the end, Israel remains blind and deaf to the reasons for their captivity and how to end it. That's how chapter 42 basically ends. So we'll see that by the end of the night tonight as well. So we'll jump into the text, verses 1 through 7 of chapter 41. And this was a little bit different because so much of this section of Isaiah is poetry. You'll notice that it's written in like a stanza form. And I preserved that in the way that I put it up on the slides so that you can kind of see the way the stanzas fall in the English text, which doesn't necessarily always lend itself to the best formatting on the slides. So if it looks a little different, that's why. It's because this is all written in poetry form, and I didn't mess with the formatting for the slides. Verses 1 through 7. Coastlands, listen to me in silence, and let the peoples gain new strength. Let them come forward, then let them speak. Let us come together for judgment. Who has aroused one from the east, whom he calls in righteousness to his feet? He delivers up nations before him and subdues kings. He makes them like dust with his sword, as the wind-driven chaff with his bow. He pursues them, passing on in safety, by a way he had not been traversing with his feet. Who has performed and accomplished it, calling forth the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, am the first, and with the last I am he. The coastlands have seen and are afraid. The ends of the earth tremble. They have drawn near and have come. Each one helps his neighbor and says to his brother, be strong. So the craftsman encourages the smelter, and he who smooths metal with the hammer encourages him who beats the anvil, saying of the soldering, it is good, and he fastens it with nails so that it will not totter. So this is the first of our courtroom metaphors. Isaiah here is calling the coastlands into jury duty. We see this in a couple other places in the biblical text. I think it's Micah does this one time, calling the mountains and the trees and the hills into a courtroom setting to pass judgment on God versus man. Basically, is who's righteous in this case, because what a jury is supposed to be a group of what? Peers. Your peers, right? And so who do we call as a peer to stand in judgment of God?
There is none.
Well, he has no peers, and so we can't just call in a group of men. Men are inherently flawed in trying to do that kind of thing, and we can't certainly wouldn't call in false gods. And so what we end up doing is calling in some majestic part of nature that can stand, because the coastlines have been there since the foundation of the world. The mountains were formed by God's hands. They've seen all of the things that he's done. And so we can call in these natural things as part of the jury to stand and witness to God's innocence.
Witness is what I was wondering, because the nature does speak of God.
Yeah, and so we are, so it's kind of it's one of those things where it's, yeah, they're calling them in sort of like a juror, but it's also sort of like a witness. It's kind of a combination of the two, because, you know, God really doesn't need people to speak on his behalf. He is truth, and everything he says is truth. And so he could just defend himself and it would be okay, but he still has the defense of those natural things that have seen how he acts and what he does. And so I just realized I've got the answers on there for the handout that I forgot to make copies of. So so the underlined things go into that pretend handout that you all have in front of you. And I just kind of clicked right there. I forgot to make copies of those. So sorry about that. So the courtroom scenes there stress how history verifies God's power and existence. I mean, where did the coastlands come from? Where did the mountains come from? Where are all these things? And so these historical and natural things that stand as a juror, as a witness of God's authenticity, of his veracity, of his truth, of his faithfulness to his people, all of these things stand as a witness that God is powerful, that he does exist. And remember, that's one of the central questions that the people have is, can God do anything about our situation? Well, the coastlands say yes, he formed us. And the mountains say yes, he brought us into existence. So the evidence is presented in this section, and God is seen to be powerful, he's seen to be existent. The coastlands here stand as jurors, and really God stands in as the only witness. He is the one in verse 1, he's the me. In verses 2 and 4, when it says who, and it's asking those questions, those are rhetorical questions. God is the answer to those questions, and so God is the one who's being spoken of there. And in verse 4, when it says I, that's God as well. And so God is the one that's standing in and providing all of the evidence. And then as that evidence is presented, the earth trembles. I mean, there is no way to resist the truth of what God is saying. And so, you hear about earth-shaking news or earth-shattering news or something like that. That's really what this is. The truth is revealed, and it shakes the foundations of the earth because of the truth of what God has presented. And so the evidence, what evidence is presented, we are going to see more of this, and there's kind of a continuation of this thought as we get later into the chapter, and so there's kind of some questions here that we answer a little bit here from verses 1 through 7, and then when we get down to the end of the chapter, we'll give a little more information to that as well. But a warrior has been summoned from the east to overthrow the oppressors, and that is the evidence that God is presenting. And so here we have Isaiah, who is prophesying about something that's going to happen 150 years into the future, and he's addressing the questions the people of that time have in their own time, which is, how do we know God is going to deliver us? Well, Isaiah's got to answer future questions about future things. So we've got to go 2 leaps into the future. We've got to go once into the future from Isaiah to get the question, and then from that point forward, we've got to go forward into the future to get the answer as well. And so Isaiah is telling the people of that time with the question, God is going to send a warrior from the east to deliver you. And that's predictive prophecy. I mean, they already should be aware of the predictive nature of what Isaiah is writing, because they're living out what Isaiah told them about 150 years ago. And now the questions that they have, Isaiah is providing answers for, even for their own future. And so that warrior has been summoned to the east to overthrow the oppressors, and that's a demonstration of God's power. It's a demonstration of his caring for them, that this far in advance, God has a plan for how he's going to deliver his people that have been taken captive. And so, so this is really earth-shattering news. It's very, it's a strong case being made for God that he has the power and the ability to deliver his people. So that gets us started with that first courtroom scene there in the first part of chapter 41. Now in the next section, chapter 41, verses 8 through 20, we have words of hope. And what more relevant thing can we speak to those who are in captivity than words of hope? And so establishing that God has the power, that he exists as part of that first opening courtroom scene, and now based on that evidence, that information, we're going to offer you hope that is founded upon that strength that God has demonstrated. So in chapters 40 through 55, there are what are often referred to as salvation oracles or salvation speeches or things that Isaiah kind of soliloquies or whatever about salvation. And this is in chapter 41, verses 8 through 20, we find the first of 11 that we'll see in the following chapters. So we'll take this in a couple of chunks here. First, we'll see verses 8 through 13. He says, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, descendant of Abraham, my friend, you whom I have taken from the ends of the earth and called from its remotest parts, and said to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not rejected you. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not anxiously look about you, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Behold, all those who are angered at you will be shamed and dishonored. Those who contend with you will be as nothing and will perish. You will seek those who quarrel with you, but will not find them. Those who war with you will be as nothing and non-existent. For I am the Lord your God, who upholds your right hand, who says to you, do not fear, I will help you." So remember, this is under the category of words of hope. This is salvation in the past, and Isaiah is going to hearken back to things that have already happened in the past and use those as reminders or as evidence for what God is promising is going to happen. So because God, that's chosen, not chosen, because God has chosen them, there is no reason to fear. And then if you look back at verses 8 and 9, how many, I don't know what you call them, terms that refer to Israel. How many names or terms of endearment or descriptions or whatever does God use to refer to Israel? You, Israel, my servant, Jacob, who I have chosen, descendants of Abraham, my friend. I've taken you from the ends of the earth, called you from its remotest parts. You are my servant. I have chosen you and not rejected you. There's at least 10 there different euphemisms or categories that we could put into, and those are all things from the past. God has done all of those things already. He's already established that those things prove his care for Israel, and they prove that he has their interest at heart. And so he's hearkening all of those things and calling them back into their remembrance so that they can have hope during their present trouble. And that's valid. That's fair for God to do. He's right to point out all the ways that he has treated them in the past to demonstrate how he's going to treat them in the future. And so, you know, think of the way that would reassure the captives. It's offering them hope. It's reminding them of the special relationship that they have with God. And then what promises does God make to the captives? If you look back at some of those verses. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Those who are angered will be shamed and dishonored. Those who contend will be nothing and perish. I mean, we can do the same thing, and there are 7, 8, 9, 10 promises there that God makes based on the history that he has with his people. I've done this for you in the past, and now you find yourself in this situation now, and here's how I'm going to react now. And so bringing that past help in is very important for the case that Isaiah is making about what God is going to do for the people. Verses 14 through 16 then, do not fear, you worm, Jacob, you men of Israel. I will help you, declares the Lord. And your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. Behold, I have made you a new sharp threshing sledge with double edges. You will thresh the mountains and pulverize them, and will make the hills like chaff. You will winnow them, and the wind will carry them away,
away, and the storm will scatter them, but you will rejoice in the Lord. You will glory in the Holy One of Israel. So this section is salvation in the present. The past section of verses was salvation from the past to illustrate what would take place in the present. Now he's talking to them about their present situation. And in the present time, God will enable them to face the Babylonians. He's going to give them the strength to stand up to their oppressors. He starts off in this section by referring to Jacob as a worm. That doesn't, I mean, go back to verses 8 and 9, where he talks about all those things, you know, my friend, my chosen ones, my servant, all those kind of buttering him up a little bit. And then he gets to this verse and he calls him a worm. That doesn't seem to be very nice. So what thoughts might you have on that? Let me find it in my notes.
I'm thinking that he's just reminding them really how small
Okay.
they are.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it. That if you go back to chapter 40, God referred to the people as grass. I mean, he kind of used that illustration of, you know, the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord stands forever. And so it wasn't that, you know, you're tiny and worthless and disgusting. It's that God is so great that in comparison, you really can't stand up to who he is. And so it's kind of the same thing here, as you're looking at what needs to happen in order for Israel to be delivered. They don't have the power to do it. They can't free themselves from captivity because they're not strong enough. And so if they are freed, it's going to have to be at the hand of God.
I'm just thinking that that's us as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And so it's very illustrative of our own situation in regards to sin. We can't free ourselves. We can't save ourselves if we rely fully on the power of God to do that. And so, you know, we have that song, for such a worm as I. And it's not that we are, you know, it's kind of the same type of language. It's not that we are less than human. It's that we are weak. We are incapable of saving ourselves. Okay? And then this section presents God as the Redeemer, and that's a great word. Hopefully we understand that word. We know what it means to be redeemed. But in their culture, think about how important the idea of a redeemer was. And it wasn't just a spiritual thing. There was actually the kinsman redeemer who could buy one of their family members or loved ones out of slavery and bring them back into the family if they've been sold into slavery. We have the story of Ruth and Boaz, and he was her kinsman redeemer, and she was basically, you know, a piece of property. If nobody would redeem her and restore her to the fortune of her family, then she was left with nothing. And it took a redeemer to restore her back to her family situation. And so God is the redeemer of the people. He restores them in a way that they cannot restore themselves. They can't buy themselves out of slavery. It takes a redeemer to do that. Verses 17 through 20, the afflicted and needy are seeking water, but there is none, and their tongue is parched with thirst. I, the Lord, will answer them myself. As the God of Israel, I will not forsake them. I will open rivers on the bare heights and springs in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water, and the dry land fountains of water. I will put the cedar in the wilderness. I can see the next slide. You can't see it. I will put the cedar in the wilderness, the acacia and the myrtle and the olive tree. I will place the juniper in the desert together with the box tree and the cypress, that they may see and recognize and consider and gain insight as well, that the hand of the Lord has done this, and the Holy One of Israel has created it. So we've gone from the past with the first few verses now, and then into the present time with the next couple of verses. What do you suppose this is? It's the future. And think about all the things that God here is saying in these verses that I will do. It's a future emphasis in this section. Isaiah tells Israel that God will take care of them. And Isaiah is offering assurances here to Israel, and he uses a couple of illustrations of this, some of that vivid imagery that we talked about with the poetry of Isaiah in this section, where he talks about that desert scene and some of those things that are taking place. Like a poor man, God will sustain them. You think of somebody who's in poverty and destitute, doesn't have the ability or the means to provide for themselves, they have to rely on other people to take care of them. And that's how Israel is. They can't take care of themselves, so they're relying on God to do that for them. They're like a wilderness that God will turn into a garden. And the picture that I have in mind there is of like a desert community. Like, I've never been to Las Vegas, but I understand it's in the middle of a desert, and it was sand and rock and nothing before people decided they were going to build there, and now there are beautiful things there because they have turned that wasteland into parts of it into gardens, and they can grow things there because they've changed the contour of the land. And so God will take that Israel, which is a wilderness, and he will turn them into a garden. And all of this will be done not to glorify Israel, but to glorify God. God doesn't do this so that other nations will point to Israel and say, look how great Israel is. God does this so that everyone will look at Israel and say, look how great their God is. And I think that may be one of the central lessons that we need to take away and remember and apply to the idea of kingdom here. We spent all of last year talking about the church's kingdom. And we need to realize that any glory the kingdom has is not for us, it's for God. And God restores us and he redeems us and he saves us, not for our glory, but for his. And so God here is reminding them through Isaiah that that's the purpose of all of this. Restoration will come, but it's for the glory of God. Our next section is verses 21 to 29. Will take us down, I think, through the end of this chapter. And this is our the second courtroom scene, or maybe the second half of the courtroom scene that was introduced in the first part of the chapter, kind of depending on how you want to look at those, whether it's a continuation of that one or whether it's a new courtroom scene. But either way works for me. Verse 21, present your case, the Lord says. Bring forward your strong arguments. The King of Jacob says, let them bring forth and declare to us what is going to take place. As for the former events, declare what they were, that we may consider them and know their outcome, or announce to us what is coming. Declare the things that are going to come afterward, that we may know that you are gods. Indeed, do good or evil, that we may anxiously look about us and fear together. Behold, you are of no account, and your work amounts to nothing. He who chooses you is an abomination. I have aroused one from the north, and he has come. From the rising of the sun he will call on my name, and he will come upon rulers as upon mortar, even as the potter treads clay. Who has declared this from the beginning that we might know, or from former times that we may say, he was right? Surely there was no one who declared. Surely there was no one who proclaimed. Surely there was no one who heard your words. Formerly I said to Zion, behold, here they are. And to Jerusalem I will give a messenger of good news. But when I look, there is no one, and there is no counselor among them who, if I ask, can give an answer. Behold, all of them are false. Their works are worthless. Their molten images are wind and emptiness. In this section, once again, God is stressing Isaiah is stressing how history verifies God's power and existence. Remember, Isaiah is writing 150 years before captivity takes place, or 100 years at least before captivity takes place. And so he's announcing all of these things before they've ever happened. But to the ones who are experiencing that, God is offering them the opportunity then to announce what's going to happen next. And if you can announce what's going to happen next, then you have equal footing with me, because I already announced it. We're here because I told you we were going to be here 100 years ago. Now, if you can tell me what's going to happen next, that will demonstrate that you are as powerful as me. And they're going to search out the land and see if anybody can do that. And what do you think is going to happen? there's no takers. There's nobody that can do that. So God challenges Babylon's gods to describe how they have orchestrated historical events according to their own will. What did the Babylonian gods do 100 years before this to predict and illustrate and demonstrate that they were going to have the Israelites captive? Do you know that 100 years before this, Babylon was nothing more than a provincial tribe? Babylon is one of the, out of all the historical empires that rose, Babylon came out of nowhere. And they arose very quickly to a height that nobody would have thought was going to happen. It would be one thing if, I mean, given, I don't know, today's world situation or something, if somebody made a prophecy about, you know, China is going to do something in the next 50 years. Well, it's plausible to believe that. China's got 1 billion people, and they've got a military that's huge, and they've got aspirations to do things. And so we might look at that and say, wow, they really called it ahead of time. But did they really? Did they really make that big of a prediction? But this is God predicting things in Isaiah's time about a kingdom that nobody thought was going to amount to anything. Babylon was not poised to become a world power 100 years before it happened. And so, so not even Babylon's own gods would have predicted this at the time that God is predicting it on their behalf. And so God's conclusion is there. I like what it says in where was it? On verse 24. Behold, you were of no account. That's kind of a modern. You hear that? He's no account. You know, that's kind of even a modern thing people might say. And they were of no account. They amounted to nothing. There is no reason for anybody to give them any credit at all. And yet, remember what 3 categories of Israelites were there in captivity? There were those who had lost hope, and there were those that had assimilated, right? And so there were those who were adopting these Babylonian gods as their own. And this is part of that resistance to that Isaiah is presenting to the people to show them that that's a mistake. See if I've missed anything here. Entirely plausible. In this section, if you look back in the first couple of verses, it says there's one that he's going to raise up, and from where is he coming?
The north.
If you go back to the beginning of the chapter, where is he coming from? From the east. And in this section,
The north.
what verses did it? 25. Okay, verse 25, I have aroused one from the north. So which is it? Is he sending a warrior from the north or from the east?
Northeast.
Well, guess where Persia was in relation to Babylon? Northeast. And so, kind of yes. I mean, kind of both. And we're going to see that this, later on, we're going to see that this is pointing to Cyrus, the king of Persia, who's going to end up being the one that brings an end to the Babylonian Empire. So, or at least assimilates the Babylonian Empire into their own. And so it is Cyrus that we're talking about here, the warrior that God is raising that's going to take out Babylon. Okay, so that concludes chapter 41. You've got 17 minutes to get through 42. All right, I think we can do it. 42 verses 1 through 9. Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry out or raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not be disheartened or crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands will wait expectantly for his law. For thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and its offspring, who gives breath to the people on it, and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I will also hold you by the hand and watch over you. And I will appoint you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations. to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the dungeon, and those who dwell in darkness from the prison. I am the Lord, that is my name. I will not give my glory to another, nor my praise to graven images. Behold, the former things have come to pass. Now I declare new things. Before they spring forth, I proclaim them to you. So here, God promises a servant. What was it that the Babylonian gods were able to do? Nothing. They couldn't predict anything. They couldn't promise anything. They couldn't tell you what's going to happen before it happened. And so now that God has called for them to make a prediction, to establish their credentials, and that even goes back to what God told Moses in the law. If a prophet brings forth a message, wait and see if it happens. If it happens, then he's a good prophet. If it doesn't happen, then take him out and stone him because he's a false prophet. And so God here offers them the opportunity to establish their credentials. They don't do it because they can't. And now God's going to go a step further and say, well, I'll do it. I'll call my next shot because God has the power to do that. He's not afraid to do that. So the Babylonian gods are powerless, but God sends his servant to accomplish his will and set things right. And so it was God who called the shot that said, we're going to be here now at this point, and Babylon's going to have you in captivity. And now I'm going to call the next shot, and I'm going to say how you're going to be rescued from Babylonian captivity. Because who's running the show? I mean, it's God. He's the one that's in charge, and he is going to call the shots. So, who might the servant be?
According to Matthew, it was Jesus.
Okay, that's cheap. What? Say that out loud so everybody can see it. Hear it.
Well, Matthew 12.
Okay, Matthew 12. Read it. What's it say?
Aware of this, Jesus withdrew, this verse 15, from that place. Many followed him, and he healed all their sick, warning them not to tell who he was. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love and whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he leads justice to victory. In his name the nations will put their hope.
It doesn't get much clearer than that. I mean, Matthew quotes directly from Isaiah and from this passage in Isaiah and applies that to Jesus. In fact, Jesus did these things in order to fulfill the prophecy that was made about him by Isaiah the prophet. And so I'm not going to argue with Matthew one little bit. And I agree, it is Jesus. Now, who else is it? Or is it anybody else? Can prophecies have more than one application? I think so, because
Are you thinking of John the Baptist?
no. Now this don't throw things at me when I ask this question because if it sounds bad because it's not. What did Jesus do to deliver the Israelites from Babylonian captivity?
Well, he was.
Did Jesus do that? I mean, did Jesus come and overthrow the Babylonian empire so that they could return from captivity?
No, but he was with God.
Well, he was part of it. I'm sure he was there, but was he the warrior that came from the north or from the east that overthrew the Babylonian government?
No.
No, I mean that wasn't Jesus.
God has always used mankind to do his work.
Yeah.
And so when Jesus did come to earth as a human, there was a time and a place for that.
Absolutely. And so we have, I think, this is one of those cases, I think, where we do have kind of a dual application of this prophetic passage, that God is calling his shots, and he's calling more than one shot at a time. He's obviously referring to Jesus in a spiritual sense, as a spiritual deliverer, because Matthew uses this passage and applies it to Jesus, and there's no question that Jesus fits all of this and fulfills all of this prophecy spiritually. in a way that nobody else ever did or nobody else ever can. But Jesus wasn't the one that came to deliver the Israelites from Babylonian captivity. He's not the one that God sent to do that. God sent somebody, and later in Isaiah, he's going to name him by name to say, this is the one that is going to send my people back home out of captivity. And so, we have several times through the Old Testament, we even have New Testament writers that sort of compare Jesus to Old Testament characters. We have the Hebrew writer comparing Jesus to Melchizedek. And so we have, it's called a type and an antitype, not A-N-T-I, it's A-N-T-E, antitype of relationship with one another. And so you have Melchizedek as the type and Jesus as the antitype, the aftertype, the real one. And in this case, I think we have Cyrus, who is the type. He is a deliverer of God's people. And God has set things in motion that's going to bring about this man named Cyrus, a deliverer from the northeast. And he's going to come and he's going to bring the people out of captivity. And he stands as a pattern of what Jesus is going to do spiritually. Now, who do we like better, Jesus or Cyrus? It's okay to say the answer. We like Jesus better, right? I mean, he's the one we want. But if we can learn something about the coming Messiah based on how Cyrus delivers God's people from physical captivity, that's okay too. I mean, that's a good thing. God has prepared us to receive the best fulfillment of that prophecy by showing us a pattern that is going to follow. And so, yes, prophecies can have more than one application. We have to be careful with that. Sometimes people go crazy with those things, and all of a sudden we're going to get 30 or 40 fulfillments of this prophecy, and we're just going to see this prophecy fulfilled every other Tuesday or something, in some things. And I think we want to find clear relationships between the way those prophecies are fulfilled and how they relate to one another and how they relate to the specific time settings in which they are taking place. But I think this is one of those cases where it's clear that we have two fulfillments of this prophecy. So did that stir anything up? Am I still good, guys? All right, okay. I want to make sure nobody's mad at me. Let's see. Okay. Moving on to chapter 42, verses 10 through 13. It says, "Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing his praise from the end of the earth. You who go down to the sea and all that is in it, you islands and those who dwell on them. Let the wilderness and its cities lift up their voices, the settlements where Kedar inhabits. Let the inhabitants of Selah sing aloud. Let them shout for joy from the tops of the mountains. Let them give glory to the Lord and declare his praise in the coastlands. Let the Lord will go forth like a warrior. He will arouse his zeal like a man of war. He will utter a shout. Yes, he will raise a war cry. He will prevail against his enemies." So here in this section, we have Israel responding to the God of hope and history with praise. And so this is a hymn that sings the praises of God after this announcement of a servant that's going to come and deliver them. So God has called his shot. We trust that God is able to do that because he's done it in the past and it's come true. And now God is telling us about something he's going to do, and we trust that it's going to happen because he's proven he can do it. And so now in response to that, we're going to sing his praises. And hymns often conclude sections of Isaiah where we have kind of a major truth or a major prediction that's revealed or whatever. And those passages there are some that we'll see in the coming weeks. But Isaiah has several sections where hymns play an important part, and this is just one of those sections. So who are the ones then that are invited to join in the praise?
Those have been redeemed.
Okay, the end of the earth, those who go to the sea, the islands, the wilderness, its cities, the settlements of Kedar, I don't know what that is, the inhabitants of Selah, I don't know where that is, the tops of the mountains, the coastlands. So that pretty much includes everybody, right? I mean, God's deliverance, is it just going to be, for a select few? No, it pretty well covers everybody. Everybody's going to be involved in singing praises to God for the deliverance that He's promised, because everybody is going to benefit from the deliverance that God brings. And so, so all the people are invited to join in the praise. Our final section here, verses 14 to 25. I have kept silent for a long time. I have kept still and restrained myself. Now, like a woman in labor, I will groan. I will both gasp and pant. I will lay waste the mountains and hills and wither all their vegetation. I will make the rivers into coastlands and dry up the ponds. I will lead the blind by a way they do not know, and paths they do not know I will guide them. I will make darkness into light before them, and rugged places into plains. These are the things I will do, and I will not leave them undone. They will be turned back and be utterly put to shame, who trust in idols, who say to molten images, you are our gods. Hear, you deaf, and look, you blind, that you may see. Who is blind but my servant, or so deaf as my messenger whom I send? Who is so blind that he is at peace with me, or so blind as the servant of the Lord? You have seen many things, but you do not observe them. Your ears are open, but none hears. The Lord was pleased for his righteousness' sake to make the law great and glorious. But this is a people plundered and despoiled. All of them are trapped in caves or are hidden away in prisons. They have become a prey with none to deliver them, and a spoil with none to say, give them back. Who among you will give ear to this? Who will give heed and listen hereafter? Who gave Jacob up for spoil and Israel to plunderers? Was it not the Lord against whom we have sinned, and in whose ways they were not willing to walk, and whose law they did not obey? So he poured out on them in the heat of his anger, in the fierceness of battle, and it set him aflame all around, and yet he did not recognize it, and it burned him, but he paid no attention. Israel does not understand the purpose of their captivity or the potential of their return. This is kind of a tragic end to this section. I mean, we've been built up kind of through this, God displaying through history how he's performed faithfully for his people, how he's demonstrated over and over his power and his ability to act on their behalf. He's promised to send the servant. He's promised to send a deliverer. He's got a warrior coming to rescue them. All of these things. We've just sung a song of hymn, sung a hymn of praise to God because of what he has promised to do for his people. And then we end with this. And this is basically God saying, you people still don't get it. You're blind and you are deaf. You don't understand the things that have happened to you. You don't understand why you're here in captivity. And you don't understand the significance of the things that I'm going to do to bring you out of captivity. And so it's just kind of more of the same old stuff that we've seen from Israel over and over and over again through the years, through the centuries. And it's a little bit disheartening. God explains his role here in the lives of the exiles by the frequent use of the pronoun I in this section. And so when we read about the he and the him there in those last couple of verses, that's most of those are referring to Israel. There at the end, yet he did not recognize it burned him, but he paid no attention. That's Israel. But the beginning of that verse, so he poured out on him the heat of his anger. That's one of those sections where you've got to get the he's and the hims in the right place. So he, God, poured out on him, Israel, the heat of his, God's anger. And they didn't get it. They're not understanding why God does what he does. The sin of idolatry is what sent them into exile, but Israel is not listening. They are not hearing the message that God is trying to get across to them. And so think about all of that imagery of God establishing himself as being superior to the idols, superior to the gods of the Babylonians, and you still have Israelites that are assimilating into that Babylonian religion. You still have Israelites that are clinging to the idols that they brought with them out of captivity, or from captivity, out of Israel into captivity. I couldn't say it right. You still have them clinging to that idolatrous practice. And they don't get it that that's why they're there. That's why they're in captivity. But still they pray to those idols and they cling to those. So Israel is not listening to the way that God is chasing him. That brings us to the end of my notes, which is right on time. And I didn't put the last slide on there, which is to read chapters 43 through 45 for next week. 43, 44, 45 will be in next week's lesson. So there you go. Any final thoughts? We've still got 1 minute.
Good job.
All right. Thank you.